Hello everyone, we will continue with the topic aesthetic comfort, okay, which is actually purely psychological nature. In last class we have discussed that it is a complex interrelationship between clothing aesthetics and body attributes. So, we have discussed also that through clothing person always tries to emphasize the positive attributes of the body and hiding the negative features, and there are 4 different components of clothing aesthetic concepts, and these are the simplified polar scale, subjective evaluation expressed by the words, physiological sensations like visual, tactile, kinesthetic. So, these are extremely important, we will discuss. Okay. So, basically the clothing aesthetics has to be one of these 3 physiological sensations, either visual or tactile or kinesthetics. Like visual means it has to be in the term of drape, okay, color, okay, design. Okay, tactile means it is a touch, it is a harsh, this, and all this physiological sensation we have to see, can we measure objectively. In this segment we will discuss how to measure this physiological sensation objectively, okay, so that we can get some objective value. So, we will try to see here the evaluation, how to evaluate the aesthetics. So, measurement of aesthetics is not that simple. Basically, aesthetics is a complex interrelationship between the various concepts. So, these concepts are style of clothing, surface texture of clothing, drapability of clothing, cover means how the fabric is covered, it is a top cover, or how the actually threads are actually covered the total area, that is a cover, creasing, wrinkle, resilience characteristics of fabric. These are the actually this all this complex interrelationship ultimately gives us the aesthetic concept. Basically the it is very easy to measure the physical characteristics, any like mass of the fabric. There are standard methods of measurement like air permeability, thermal transmission, okay. So, thickness. So, this we can measure very easily, okay, by objective method, but it is very difficult to measure the clothing aesthetics, because it is a totally subjective in nature. Due to its significant subjectivity, the aesthetic characteristics cannot be measured accurately, and there is no standard method of measurement of aesthetics of clothing. So, the fabric aesthetics is entirely subjective, and different people will actually evaluate or judge based on his own perception. I may judge a fabric, it is aesthetically beautiful, but some other person will actually depending on his personal its perception. Okay. So, that we have also discussed earlier, it is the wearer attitude towards the clothing, okay. That own it is based on its own perception, he judge the clothing. Okay. So, there is no standard method of measurement of clothing aesthetics. Okay. Either we can go for subjective measurement or we have to go for objective measurement. Okay. The subjective measure we can measure it subjectively, but there is a total subjectivity is there, like color of clothing. If we try to measure, I may like a particular color, okay, I can rate it very high rating, but the same color may not be liked by others. Okay. So, it is due to its subjectivity, it is very difficult to measure the aesthetics. Okay. So, the main problem is its subjectivity. Okay. So, that we can use by proper questioning of the clothing. This is if it is done properly, the questioning is done properly, then numerical data can be, like we have used that different type of rating scale we can use here, and then the from the subjective rating we can use the different statistical technique to get the value, actual value. Okay. Now, the steps are that we have to get some subjective rating by common words like texture, fall, style. Okay. So, different rating scale we can use here, then the rating scale, then we have to transmit this rating scale to numerical definition of specific aesthetic property. Okay. The aesthetic perceptions are the combinations and interrelationship between measurable physical data. It is a like rigid, flexible, soft, and this is one. Then values which are psychological factors. So, there is good, bad, meaning, that is a beautiful, ugly. So, these are the this interrelationship between this and combination of this data. Okay. Now, some terminologies associated with this aesthetic of clothing are conceptual. So, that we cannot actually get the value. Drape, like hand, these are conceptual. Okay. The drape of fabric is good. So, this may not be good or bad, it may not have a particular value, like higher drape, whether higher drape is good or lower drape is good, that we do not know, that depends on the application. Okay. Like surface texture is sometimes these parameters are defined to represent the sense data, surface texture. Okay. Fabric may be aesthetically very nice, its look wise it is very nice, but if its surface texture is rough, then we may not feel comfortable, at least for a particular environmental condition. Like example is tweed coat. Okay. The tweed fabric, it's aesthetically it is very pleasant, it is very nice clothing, but at warm condition, in winter it is used for winter garment, but the same clothing in warm condition it will give us uncomfortably. So, that the tactile sensation is also very important, one of the very important part. The wearers are asked to evaluate the qualities identified by the simple polar word. Okay. Just it is a smooth or rough, soft or hard, flexible or rigid. So, this subjective polar words that he has to evaluate. Okay. One thing we should be very careful, we have to actually avoid any confusing word, confusing term we have to avoid, like confusing term is for example, for evaluating a drape of a fabric, if one wants to decide the fabric whether it is a good or bad. So, if we give the polar term like good or bad, and we have asked the wearer to evaluate or person to evaluate the drape, a good or bad, sometimes it creates confusion, because drape cannot be good or bad, although it is a visual appearance. To give a fabric a good or bad rating in terms of drape, we should first know the application. Like for skirt, a fabric, a drape may be good, but the same fabric if you use say for cotton, that may be bad for that. Okay. So, this type of confusing term we have to avoid, or say like if we want to have drape, if you want to know the drape characters for, so simpler terms we have to use, polar term we can use to have the drape. So, we do not use the good or bad, we have to use whether fabric is a soft or stiff or flexible. So, designing the parameter, okay, attributes, it is very important, okay, which are related to fabric. So, flexible or stiff is related to drape characteristics. So, for evaluating the drape, we should not use good or bad, else we should use flexible or stiff. Okay. So, these are the basic guidelines. To set the aesthetic concept, it must contain one of the three physiological sensations. Okay. One is visual sensation, tactile sensation and kinesthetic sensation, and the concept can be a combination of sub concepts also expressed by the word which are most explicit. The example is that, for example, the resilience, if we want to know the resilience as far as the aesthetic concept is concerned, resilience we should know what type of resilience. Resilience means it has to basically after deformation it should come back. Okay. So, whether it is a compressional resilience or it is a bending resilience, that we should be very actually carefully design. Okay. Otherwise, the measurement will be, it will not be perfect. Okay. Like tactile sensation, if we want to measure whether should we go for compressional resilience. So, its resilience if we see, it is directly related with the tactile sensation. Okay. So, one of the three physiological sensations should be there for aesthetic comfort. We will see that somewhere it will be related with this. Similarly, the cloth cover, okay, cloth cover, it is a visual sensation, whether fabric looks at full or it is a open structure. So, that gives a visual sensation. So, one of the three this type of sensations should be there. Okay. Now, we will discuss that how to measure this aesthetic concepts objectively, so that we can get a particular value of measurement. Okay. Now, this most commonly used concepts, aesthetic concepts are cover of the fabric, drape of the fabric, body of the fabric, style of the fabric, surface texture and resilience. So, all these 7 aspects we will try to see how to convert this aesthetic aspect, psychological aspects to the objectively measurable parameters. So, we will see one by one how cover can be measured objectively, drape can be measured. So, this we will discuss. First we will start with the cover. What is cover? Cover we can subdivide into two terms, one is top cover and bottom cover. What is top cover? If we take a cloth, so surface fibers, surface yarns, how it is actually covering the total area, that is called top cover, and bottom cover is that the actual presence of the yarn at the bottom of this, bottom of the surface, which is actually. Now, one example I will give you, like we can get one fabric with very open structure cotton fabric. Okay. That means it does not have any bottom and top cover, it is a simple cover. Now, open structure fabric, but after that we start brushing. We have seen that different type of fabric, we start brushing. What will happen? That loose fibers, hairs will start covering the total structure. We will not be able to see the structure at all. That means the fabric's top cover is good. It is a top cover, its fabric, it is good. If we see the back side, which is not actually brushed, it is open structure. The bottom cover is it is a open. Similarly, there are different types of, like if you see the velvet, if you see the top cover of velvet is very nice, very aesthetically it is nice. Okay. Bottom cover we do not bother, bottom may be anything. So, that is why it is a basically cover, top cover is the degree of obscurity of the fabric weave pattern due to surface fuzziness. That whatever the fabric weave pattern, it is covering the fuzzy fibers, that is loose fibers are covering, it is called top cover. And the bottom cover is that the degree of obscurity of the fabric weave pattern due to the sublayer, due to the presence of yarn. Like weave structure is not very clear for the fabric with high EPI PPI. Okay. So, that means if you have higher EPI PPI, that means you will get the very good bottom cover. Okay. And so, then how to measure? How to measure this? How to measure objectively? Cover is okay, these are the subjective, it is a aesthetic aspects. Now, I can have a fabric top cover, it is a good, it is a complete, okay, but it is a very difficult to express. Okay. But objectively how can we measure? The cover can be expressed by dense open, fuzzy clean, okay, smooth rough, full lean. So, all these types, but these are the subjective term. Okay. Now, can we measure? Can we measure this cover objectively by the help of instrument? Yes. If we measure the light transmission, we will get the idea of the cover, how much light is it is allowing to pass. By air permeability, if the fabrics, two fabrics are there, once air permeability is high, higher air permeability means its cover is good. Indirectly we are getting like surface contact. If we measure the surface contact area, from there we can measure, get the idea of the cover. So, objectively we can measure this psychological or aesthetic parameter. These are the subjective measurement, and that we are converting the cover to the actually objective measurement. Now, coming to the drape. Drape is a subjective, it is although drape coefficient can be measured, or drape coefficient is a already established subjective objective measurement. Now, what is drape? Drape is the fall of clothing. It is basically a fabric, the form of fabric will assume due to its own mass when you are hanging freely, that is the drape. It may be pleasant, it may be nice drape. Okay. So, drape subjectively we can express, as we have explained earlier also, clinging or flowing, it is a that way, it is a it is a fabric is flowing, okay. That way we can. Dead or live, okay. It is a live, it is a nicely draped, or it is very stiff, it is a dead. That way we can express. Crisp or limp, its fabric is very crispy, or it is a limp, that way we can. So, this there are different term, but these are all subjective term. It is very difficult to evaluate the value, it is difficult to actually judge, although we can judge using the some rating scale, okay. But can we measure the drift objectively? Yes, it can be objectively evaluated by measuring bending rigidity. We can measure bending rigidity to evaluate whether it is a cleansing or flowing by cantilever or loop method. If we measure the bending rigidity, we will get, or drape coefficient by drape meter. So, that way we can get the drape value, okay. Objectively we can measure the drape, okay. This fabric, if it is stiff one, so it will give the high rigidity. So, what is the cantilever method? Cantilever very Shirley stiffness tester, we can measure, use the Shirley stiffness tester, that and even loop, heart loop, different types of loop method we can use, okay. Next one is the body. What is body of the clothing? The body is the overall substance of the clothing, of the fabric between two edges, between two selvages, what is the total substance of the clothing. So, the clothing, its body is very nice, okay. So, that the perception of total substance of fabric during use. So, that it is a body wise we can say the body of the fabric expressed by light or heavy. The fabric is light, it is a body, it is a heavy, lofty or thin, this is a body, but the material content is a body, bulky or sleazy, that is it is a body, it is a body of the clothing, full or lean. These are the subjective term, aesthetic term is used. So, these aesthetic terms are okay to express, but to quantify we have to use the objective technique, objective term. So, objectively we can measure this body of the clothing by evaluating the mass per unit area. If we measure the mass per unit area, then we know the quantity of the material, okay. It is a light or heavy, we can measure the mass per unit area, or we can measure the thickness, okay, whether it is a bulky thickness measurement or porosity measurement. So, it is if it is open structure or it is that body of the fabric is it is not very complete, it is not compact, it is a open structure. So, porosity or density we can give. So, this subjective terms we can convert, we can measure in objective way, okay. These are the measurable quantity, okay. Next is the style of clothing. So, what is that? So, this style is very nice, okay. This is totally subjective, okay, aesthetically, aesthetic perception, okay. This is actually totally visual aesthetics. Now, the style, it can be perceived through color, pattern or type of clothing, okay. So, this style of clothing is it is very nice. That means, whether is it color is nice or its pattern is nice. So, this is the all this the color, pattern, a type of clothing, whether it is a perfectly fit. So, this all these things related to style. So, style, the clothing style is evolved from the combination of combined perceptions of the textile arts and technology, okay. So, this art and technology, if you combine, then it comes the style. Okay. So, this is objectively measured by color value. Suppose this two fabric, the style, this two fabric, if we see, this one gives the lighter color, okay, and this is darker. Then style wise, if we see, it's a lighter, okay, and this is darker, but subjectively we cannot evaluate. We cannot evaluate this. We cannot tell. Okay, this is only it gives the lighter shade and darker shade. But objectively, if we measure the color value, what is the depth of the shade, then we can compare this style. And this to actually to reproduce this value, we cannot use the subjective value. So, lighter color, lighter blue color, light blue color, you give me light blue color. What is the reference? For that we have to measure the color value. If we can give someone this color value you measure, so then produce, then one can objectively measure, or subjectively what we have to do, we have to match the shade. If we match the shade, then color value we can, then depth of the shade. So, depth of the shade you can control. So, color value, depth of the shade, and weave structure. Like this fabric, the style depends on the weave structure. Like a fabric, it is a denim. Denim fabric with twill structure will give us some aspects, it gives us some aesthetic appeal. But if we change the weave structure, like plain denim, keeping everything same, color, everything same, ends per inch, peaks per inch, everything same, if we simply change the weave structure, what will happen? We will have totally different aesthetics. So, weave structure we can measure the weave structure objectively. So, two fabrics, it gives different attributes, different aesthetic attributes, but if we see its a color is same, everything is same, but it gives different attributes. So, simply by changing the weave structure, it gives different style, okay, and aesthetic appeal. So, by changing, by knowing the weave structure, so weave structure, measurement of weave structure is very important. One example, like if we want to increase the luster of the clothing, so I want a brighter lustrous clothing. So, keeping everything same, yarn, colored, everything same, if we change say from plain to satin, so its totally aesthetic appeal will change, its basically its look will change. So, that weave structure, if we measure the weave structure, it is a measurable quantity. If we measure the weave structure, then we can say okay, this fabric with say denim with twill structure gives very good aesthetic appeal. But if we measure if we use the denim with say satin, it will give total awkward may give total awkward feeling. Okay. On the other hand, if we use say for bed sheet or for some other application, we normally use the say satin weave. Okay. In place of that, if we use say twill weave in bed sheet, it will give us totally different aesthetic appeal. Okay. So, by measuring the weave structure, so we can get the aesthetic appeal of a fabric. Okay. Similarly, yarn structure, say if we change the yarn structure little bit, it will give us totally different aesthetic appeal. Just like a yarn, if we change the yarn twist, what will happen? If we change the yarn twist, it will give us the reflection is a random reflection. Okay. Light will start diffracting. what will happen? The cloth will look little bit dull. Okay. And if we keep on reducing the twist, the fibers will be parallel, and then it will give the regular reflection, and increasing the twist will give irregular reflection. So, brightness of cloth we can actually control by changing the yarn structure. Similarly, if we see the compact yarn and normal ring yarn, the style wise compact yarn gives a better aesthetic appeal. Why? Because compact yarn we can use lower level of twist, and also compact yarn has got less hairiness. So, it actually reflects light, regular reflection takes place. So, compact yarn gives better aesthetic comfort, aesthetic appeal. Okay. And on the other hand, ring spun yarn gives poor appeal. Similarly, if we use say friction spun drape yarn has got random surface yarn or surface fiber, and which gives irregular reflection and dull look. So, depending on our requirement, we can select the clothing, okay, select the yarn structure, okay, which gives the. So, suppose a particular application where we need dull look, okay, like in denim, if it is bright, it may not be aesthetically appealing. Okay. We need in denim, it is a little bit dull look. So, there we can use yarn structure with random fiber arrangement, even drape friction spun yarn we can use there. Okay. And clothing pattern is whether it is a plain shade, it is a solid shade, or it is a stripe. If it is stripe, what is the color combination? If it is the particular color combination, what is the repeat size? So, that all these things changes that. So, whether it is a broad stripe, whether it is a fine stripe, whether it is a check. So, what are the different color combination in the check? Everything gives the different types of aesthetic appeal. Okay. And this aesthetic appeal, this clothing pattern we can easily actually measure objectively by measuring the weave pattern. Okay. Weave pattern means the color pattern. How many, say it is a red and white color is there, red in, if whether it is a stripe or check. If it is stripe, say we are using say 10 red, 10 white, 10 red, 10 white, it will give a particular type of appeal. So, if we change the ratio, say 2 red, 20 white, 2 red, 20 white, altogether it will give the totally different aesthetic aspects, but objectively it is very easy to measure, and subjectively we can say, oh, it is a good appeal, okay, it is a very nice clothing. Then immediately from the subjective rating we can measure the clothing pattern. Okay. Similarly, feet or another thing, suppose it is we want to have check. So, for check pattern, if we want to have check, so we have to use both warp wise color pattern and weft wise color pattern. And if we change, keeping the say ratio of threads constant, if we simply interchange the color or change the color, okay, it will give us a totally different aesthetic appeal. Okay. Similarly, next is that style is the feet of garment. The particular garment, if we change the size, we will see that it is it will give us totally different aesthetic aspects. In market, it is a regular experience, we all experienced. Suppose for me it is a say 40 size, it is as per Indian standard, it is a 40 size is it is perfect. If I wear say it is a say large size is, so if I wear extra large, so total aesthetics will change, and if I smaller size, so total aesthetics will totally change. Okay. So, the fabric fit we can measure by measuring the size of the, this fabric fit part, how to measure the garment fit we will discuss in other segment. Okay. This is actually objectively measured. Then surface texture, we simply say texture is very nice, it is a subjective, it is a smooth, it is a harsh, it is a rough. These are the some tactile sensation. Okay. It means tactility, surface roughness and pattern of clothing. Okay. This tactile and visual perception of clothing, this is a visual perception. Okay. And generally this surface texture we express in terms of some subjective term like smooth, rough, dry, clammy, okay, grainy, plain. So, slippery, sticky, these are the various terms we use for expressing the surface texture. Okay. Soft, hard, so these are the surface texture of the clothing. Okay. But this surface texture we can measure objectively, okay, by objective methods, and this is done by the surface roughness. So, in by Kawabata evaluation tester we can measure the surface roughness, how rough is the surface, okay, how smooth is the surface, that roughness that we can measure, that we will discuss somewhere. Okay. And there are other parameters we can measure, that is surface friction. By measuring the surface friction we can measure the surface roughness, okay, like which will give us the slippery or sticky, that can be measured by the surface friction. The surface friction may be fabric to fabric surface friction or fabric to any other surface, any other like fabric to maybe metal. So, that this will get the surface frictional characteristics. Also we can measure the optical reflectance of a fabric surface. By optical reflectance we can measure, we can get the idea about the surface, whether the reflection is regular reflection or whether it is irregular reflection. So, that reflectance of a surface we can measure, and objectively that will give us the surface characteristics, whether it is a nice dull or lustrous. So, dull or lustrous, this characteristics we can measure by optical reflectance. Okay. And then it comes the contact point, okay, or contact area. So, number of contact point we can also measure with other surface. This contact point will give us different like pricky sensation. If the contact point is high number of contact points are there, so it sometimes gives pricky sensation, or warm cool touch, like we will discuss in our other segment. The warm cool touch depends on the number of contact points. If the contact point is very high, contact area is very high, higher contact area, then it will give us the cool touch. So, and then the surface fuzzy fibers, we can measure the fuzziness of fiber. So, number of fibers present on the surface, so that we can also measure by some objective technique. So, this will give us the surface the fuzzy or hairy or clean structure, that can be measured by surface fuzziness objectively. Okay. Then resilience, we call the term resilience, it is in terms of how it comes back from deformation, like wrinkle or crease. The fabric it creases, it is a wrinkled, that means its resilience is poor. Okay. Similarly, compression it is deformed after pressing, so like a carpet, if its compression resilience is poor, so it will give total deformation. Okay. Like extensional resilience, it is very important. Like sometimes we see that some fabric after using it sometime bags, like it is a very common experience in knee or in some elbow, we sometime feel that fabric it got actually extended, it is bulge out. This is that resilience, extensional resilience is poor. So, or liveliness it comes back. So, this all this resilience characteristics it gives some aesthetic appeal. So, the perception of wrinkle or crease resilience is the ability of fabric to recover from the wrinkle. So, how to measure? So, it can be measured by the that wrinkle recovery, crease resistance testing or compression resilience, that we can if we measure. So, we can get all this resilience related characteristics. So, this can be measured, it is the ability of the fabric to return from the previous position after deformation. Okay. So, it is thank you. So, we will end this session of psychological comfort. Next, we will start the neurophysiological comfort aspects. Thank you.